we've been talking a lot about flattening and how things get flattened in certain situations. And I wanted to talk tonight about how a flattened version of a thing can become extended. So the situational restricted version of itself enters a new situation in which it brings about more qualities about itself. And I wanted to use these two clocks as an example because they have a nice story behind it. And these two pendulum clocks refer to a story about Huygens, who invented the pendulum clock. And he wanted to invent a clock that would counterbalance the movement of ships in bad weather and to give precise time in order for sailors to calculate their position. And he figured that in order to have an exact time, you need a pendulum that would counterbalance the movement, and you would also need two clocks on the ship in case one gets broken. But when he hung them up on the wooden beam, he observed that about half an hour before putting them together, they would sink in an out of phase motion. So the pendulums would move like this, and they would sink to tell the exact same time every time. And this became known as Huygens synchronization. And it took about 300 years to actually understand why. And it has to do with the transfer of energy between the two clocks through the wooden beam they're placed on. Yeah, so like I said, this event where two clocks were put together showed a property of the clocks that was existent, but was still not perceived or still not recognized as part of the clocks. And this is as a starting point of talking about how different situations can enrich other situations and the restricted version of things in them. So this is my input for tonight. What do you guys think?
It's a nice example.
It's a nice. Had never heard about that.
What I also like is that so this is a really rich context that's behind the clocks. It's the whole history of like maritime navigation and the issues it dealt with, like actually positioning yourself without GPS just by looking at time or the stars. But it didn't end there. It also influenced a lot of developments in mathematics, science, and also clockmaking. How do you think this relates either to TTT or object-oriented ontologies in general?
I guess it's a very nice example of how things can relate between themselves without humans mediating the relation. No? I mean, it's kind of obvious, but I think it's especially interesting because there are actually two man-made objects, but then like they have a relation between them that goes beyond the what the same people who designed them could even expect to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they go beyond what they were, simply what they were initially kind of designed to do. They show these properties that were unplanned and unexpected. And I also think it's interesting that it's not only a relationship between the two clocks, but with the beam that in which they are hung, as you explained, that it seems to be quite central. So it kind of connects it with the other stuff around the clocks as well.
Mm-hmm. I also thought of that when choosing the example, but then again, we're also always confronted with like the empiricist argument that the synchronization that we observe there is just an ordered conjunction of our perceptions, and we derive from that perception a causal relation between the clocks that is not precisely belonging to the two clocks, but to our own association of perceptions. Now that Hume is a topic with the university uh, removing the name of Hume from a building, how could we respond to Hume's argument?
I guess you can contradict that by the element of surprise. I mean, before they noticed that the clocks would synchronize, they didn't think it would synchronize, and they were, that was their expectation, I guess, that each one would do its thing. And then they were surprised by the fact that they did synchronize. And any expectation that you have, once it's contradicted by an observation, I guess, could just sort of shatter that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an important element. Surprise, the unexpected, and also that.
And that the objects can have that capacity of
Mhm,
surprising us unexpectedly, even when they are, made by us, as in
mhm.
the case of the clocks.
Yeah, I think that's also something that strikes me, that the unexpected, and furthermore that the unexpected also can contribute to enlarging the set of like knowledge or cognitive perceptions that we have. That is an indication, or can be an indication, of things existing independently of what we predicate about them. And I recently discovered uh, Critical Realism by Roy Bhaskar, if you guys know him. And he he poses an interesting question, namely, how is the world made up in order for experiments, for example, to be possible, in order for knowledge to be advanced through experiments. And he says that things are intrinsically out of phase with our own perception, and that they are also intransitive, but at the same time can become transitive. And out of phase means exactly this, that they don't always accord with our perceptions. They might surprise us, they might generate new experiences. And the intransitive part means precisely this, that they are not exhausted by our own predicates, but that part of them are transitive because we can form propositions about them. And if this were not true, he says, then experiments would always have the same result, and experiments would always be tautological. They would just show what we already know.
Yeah, but the question that you now asked, Raspan, was slightly different from the beginning question, because now you are sounding as if Hume denied the reality of nature or natural objects, but what he's denying is our own capacity to really discover through our cognitive faculties the way things are. No? So there are two different questions. Not about the reality of nature, but the way we see and the things we can know about it.
Yeah, this distinction, which I think is what Fetty's getting at, is not that Hume is denying that there's something out there. It's denying that the structure that we give it is out there. So I think he's okay with surprise, or with the he's okay with sense data or whatever, wherever that comes from existing, but he's not okay with saying that we discovered how it works, say. So I think so maybe the way you phrased it, you set up a bit of a straw man, because I think you were not clear that you're sort of making it sound like Hume was against anything outside of our minds, and he's more concerned with whether the thing has some regularity, some laws, like will A always follow B, or could that change? So
So
that
he says that that those regularities only exist in our brains and they don't exist in reality. That's his point.
Yes.
or he's saying there's nothing we can find that could justify anything outside of what we're imposing on it. The sun could cease to come up tomorrow, despite the fact that it always came up, and all of our laws say that it must come up, but there's no guarantee.
That's what science is for, no? Like you can never be sure that something's is true. It's like of what reality is. So you try to, like, the only thing you can do is make sure that something is not real, that it's not there. So you try to break any belief you have, and if you can't break it, then you say, this belief, I have it, and I didn't manage to break it yet. So
Yeah, I think that's why Hume is maybe one of the heroes of science. He is he's the original empiricist, and we are empiricists. So I think I think that's very much the thinking.
So then if we rephrase the question, what Basker is trying to say is that if things exist on themselves and they generate behaviors by themselves that then can be visible in like open systems like an experiment and then can enrich knowledge, then also what we observe in those behaviors generated by belong to the things as well as to our cognition. So they are not separated. So what we see about things is real about things. It's not, they don't just exist in our brains.
that's the point of the critical realism guy.
Yes. But his point is that in order for this to be possible, and this is why his philosophy is also called transcendental realism. So in order for this kind of advancement through experiments to be possible, things have to be existing on their own accord and generate mechanisms or behaviors that exist independently of perception and can enter perception, but they can also remain hidden and then later on become discovered.
For Hume, the idea would be that the relation between things is that which we put onto them, the kind of relation. But that doesn't deny automatically that maybe things are related. But the way we think they are related as causality, or even maybe this kind of relation called synchronization, is it a thing that belongs to our way of perception or to the way that things are related? I think that would be the way to question this, relating it to Hume.
Yes, but that was also my question at the beginning. Because Hume says these correlations are not in the things and their behaviors themselves. And then Basker says, no, precisely because an experiment, for example, or science can advance knowledge about things and new properties of things that were unexpected, unseen, or uncorrelated with the same things can enter cognition, then things are, he calls them generative mechanisms that may exist outside of perception and enter perception and contribute with new properties about themselves.
I mean, the idea that knowledge can grow, I'm not sure if that's like a definitive conclusion against human, let's call it skepticism.
So Bhaskar refers specifically to experimental science. So science that you observe. And then you can also observe the advancement or the new property, and not about abstract science or not about poetry. Of course, you can advance in creative thinking, for example, but then again, also for math, there's the question of, is that an abstract domain completely isolated from everything in the world? Or is it also dependent on what certain scenarios bring about in the understanding of relations, properties, and so on and so forth, and how we can explain them? So if math itself is also motivated by certain events that require further and further development. For example, this relation between the clocks was not possible at the time of Huygens, and it required advancements in mathematics in order to explain it.
I think you're bringing up a million different topics for me, but um, you so how would Bhaskar do in an argument with Kant? So if you go from this idea that there's something out there which we perhaps impose some structure, but we also discover, um, why do we have to take this realist stance? We can also just be idealists and say, yeah, there's something out there. We can never know anything about it, but it must be there to provide the structure that we see. But there's nothing more to say about it, and that realm is not physical. It's not what we had directly grasped. So how does the critical realist answer that objection?
So I understand Kant in a direction that is friendly to realism, in the sense that for Kant, a big part of his system was also based on the ability to explain how we can form synthetic judgments. So judgments that increase the logical sphere or the cognition about a certain object. And for Kant, in order to have synthetic judgments, it is essential to have empirical data, to have empirical affection of a subject. What, what Kant does differently than Bhaskar is to talk about things in themselves that we cannot know. We have no access to it. And Bhaskar says that what we do know about things are real properties and qualities about things, but they are not the sole properties of a certain thing, because things are at the same time transitive, so they accept like predicates, and at the same time intransitive. They have parts that live on outside of experiments and then can generate new knowledge about themselves. But then again, also in the Kantian sphere, there are increasingly more powerful interpretations of Kant that argue that for Kant, there's a story about first and like primary and secondary qualities about things, and things in themselves are just things that have qualities unknown to us, while their secondary qualities is what qualifies as phenomena. And I think in this sense, Bhaskar would be compatible with Kant in the sense that that which is remains as a generative mechanism, so outside of the empirical, experimental cognition of things, could be considered a primary quality or something that withdraws and remains hidden.
When you first showed this picture, well, when I first saw the picture and you said we were going to talk about the flattening and maybe expanding of the objects, I didn't know the story behind it. And I thought it was going to be somehow related to how it looks, in the picture. Because it has this, somewhat kind of crude perspective to it. And it looks, quite flat, even though because of our pictorial kind of literacy, we see it as a 3D object, even though it's flat on the screen. And I thought it was going to be in that direction. But then the story you told really kind of gave some depth to it as well, in a different sense.
That's interesting because I think that actually points to another counter argument to the whole object oriented ontology and also to Basker, for example, in the sense that no matter how we imagine or think about things, we always put ourselves into that experience of things. So to talk about Kant, for example, for Kant, it is necessary that an empirical representation of myself always accompanies the perception of things in order to bring them to cognition, or the linguistic turn in which any meaning is conferred through our transferal of linguistic structures on the world. And the counter argument to object oriented ontology says even if we imagine a world fully empty of any human subjects, we still project ourselves and our structures into that thought and into that representation. So it is impossible to think of objects outside of our sphere of cognition or perception.
I don't think they would refute that we are somehow trapped in our kind of human perspective. But that doesn't deny that there's stuff beyond our human perspective, right?
But it does deny any thinking about objects, any plausible thinking about objects as existing in themselves. Because the argument would be even that thinking is somehow related, or even that representation of things is related to the way we think.
Well, another way of thinking it, or every way in which we see or think or speak about things, is somehow necessarily anthropomorphic.
Yes.
But on the other hand, saying that at the same time relativizes the very human perspective as being one perspective, maybe among others.
Yeah, I agree. It kind of allows for other perspectives to exist as well.
Okay, so it somehow, by saying that, we single ourselves out of this world, but that mere process of singling oneself out implies that there is a relation to something other than us. With that argument, but that still doesn't touch on the possibility of speaking about things outside of representational relation, which is also important for object-oriented ontologies to say that when you say things exist by themselves or things have qualities that are real and don't depend on the representation that we make about them.
I was thinking of Aristotle, and he poses a similar problem, but not with the concept of reality, but of truth. So is Amanda, or my perception of Amanda's having short hair, is true because I see it, or is true because Amanda has short hair? So these are the two directions of assessing the truth of something. So I'm not sure if this is the idea of reality we are talking about.
I wouldn't say it's about truth, because truth can be defined without the aid of things existing by themselves. Like you often have language theories, for example, where meaning is formed just by symbolical associations or by assigning a reference to a certain symbolic value, or also in certain strains of phenomenology where you have the interpretative part that constitutes truth. So I wouldn't say it's about truth. It's about decoupling the qualities of things or objects from their cognitive ordering. And one way out of that many from speculative realism take, is to say that the existence of things, first and foremost, does not depend on a perceiving subject, and that those things can undergo processes, changes, can interact with other things, can have properties independent of any perceiving, knowing subject.
I think that this is a crucial point, and this speculative realism, I think, is important because we're kind of arguing about not whether one, not whether there is something beyond our perception, and not whether we can say anything about it, but what is the status of the things we say. And I think you could say for speculative realism that it's a speculative statement. It's a hypothesis that when we lay out an ontology and we say there's stuff out there and it's like this and this, it's not a claim. It's not an empirical claim. It's not a claim that can be subjected to scientific testing. It's only a it's a second order hypothesis. It's let us hypothesize that hypotheses are useful, almost. The biggest hypothesis of all being that what we measure, what we perceive, are reality. That isn't itself a testable statement. It's just a kind of framework for working in, a kind of hypothesis. And it's new in some sense that it's okay to be it's okay to be realist, but it's okay to say that that's speculation. It's an ontological speculation, and maybe
I,
that's a more interesting place to be than just saying no, we can't say anything about it.
I think it's
I guess exactly, sorry, exactly because of what Razvan said, that, this thinking exists inside the human frame of thinking, and in which I described, like we're somehow trapped, but it is still okay to speculate about stuff outside of it, I think.
What I was trying to also address is not just
Right.
that it is okay, but also that it is plausible. And how can we say that it is plausible to speculate that? And I wanted to discuss with you an argument that Meyasu does, for example. And that's why I talked about this scenario where we imagine a world without humans in it. Because then we can imagine things undergoing processes without any humans in it. But then the anti realist says, yes, but even if we think of those processes in a world without humans, we necessarily relate them to our own thinking. And Meyasu's counter argument is that if this anti realist argument would be true, then it would be impossible for us to think about death. Because then we would project our existence in the thought of death, and death would be contradictory because our existence is constantly projected in the disappearance of our existence. This thinking about death that is possible shows that we can think of a world absent of ourselves and a world that continues without ourselves and continues with its own processes. And this makes plausible the speculation about things first existing without us, and second, interacting and going about their lives without us.
And if I recall correctly, in Meyasu, we find a lot of like traces of beings, living beings before humankind, and we can even search for their origins, what they were, and so on. So going to the past, we are speculating about things which existed before mankind, right?
So he talks about fossils a lot. And also, there's an important element there that we discover fossils that we then are able to date with mathematical models and uh, carbon dating to a period before the existence of humans. So that is not just imagined, but somehow objectively proved that they existed before us.
Find this the wanting for plausibility to be a pretty kind of gnarly box, not a problematic box, because you're what is what is that? It's sort of like a light version of empirical proof, or is it that it just accords with our way of thinking, which sounds like you didn't really escape the problem. If either I can think it's empirical, in which case we're back to the same problem, or I can think it's not empirical, in which case we're not realists anymore. Why do we need to keep saying why we're not only speculating, but we're also probably right?
I think speculation is not just a decision in a belief. It's more about going beyond what is presented to you and assuming something that might be negated, but then might also bring something, might also bring about something new, and then leads you to another speculation that also might be negated or might be confirmed, and so on and so forth. So like a dialectical movement.
But we got to go back and Hume has to remind us that we still don't have any proof that all these things that there's something at the top that needs to ground all of the rest. It's sort of a willingness to believe that things have laws, or in other words, here, yeah, it's like a hypothesis. It can be refuted, but there's something that remains after all the attempts at refutation or synthesis or whatever else. There's something still that isn't satisfied. It's not anything more than maybe plausible. It's not. Uh, so it's not really a hypothesis. I think this is where Harman takes pains maybe too much to distinguish what his view from science. Like, he's very clear that he thinks that science and philosophy are very different, and the kind of open-endedness of philosophy, I think, for him is much greater than for science, partly because it's not empirical. I think actually maybe the way I remember his argument is like kind of like science as one form of knowledge with certain limits versus, say, aesthetic experience and versus philosophy, which are not empirical in this hypothesis testing way. So anyway, it's it's to me, to start talking about plausibility, to start talking about wanting more, is to try to make science out of philosophy.
But let's address this from the
Right?
perspective of situations, because if we take knowledge, for example, and if we take the premise of object-oriented ontologies that subjects, knowing subjects, are just objects among other things. And if we relate to what we say in TTT, that every quality is relations, and in certain situations, only some of those relations get shown while others remain hidden, then we can address knowledge as a situation in which certain aspects of things become noticeable to the subject, and certain qualities of objects become uh, or certain qualities of the subject interact with those qualities of the object in order to define that situation as a cognition in which the qualities are ordered according to the relations brought into the situation by the subject, that in situations with other objects which don't include a subject would not be visible. And then we have both parts. We have the object that exists and contributes its relations to a situation, but the subject is also not just a passive, mushy kind of, I don't know, matter. It also contributes, it interacts with the relations, and it makes out of it what it can. But those relations that the subject brings within the situation are hidden to the interaction between the same object and another object that is not reflexive, is not cognitive or perceptive.
Well said, I think.
And I think this is what was attractive to me with this guy Bhaskar, because he has like the situation I described would be the transitive aspect of objects that can interact with cognition and also contribute to it. But then the intransitive part would be its processes or relations in situations shared with other objects, but not with a subject, for example. But these situations are dynamical and they can come together. So also the situation with the subject can integrate relations from other situations and so on and so forth. So we can talk about advancement of knowledge without excluding the existence of objects, but actually presupposing them in order to make the advancement of knowledge possible. And this would be the speculation here. The hypothesis is we don't know everything about objects, so we need to go further and relate to them further and try to expand our situations with them.
This last thing that you were saying made me think about, I've been reading a lot about extended cognition theories now. So like we are almost getting into reverting the point, you know, like not only objects can exist independently of us, but actually objects contribute to most of our process of cognition, or at least this is a way to see another way to see it. The last thing you were saying made me think about it. I was reading an article, actually. I even thought about sending it in the chat, and I will send it maybe later. It's a guy called Malafouris. I don't know if somebody of you know it.
I don't.
Which is the article is called Mind and Material Engagement, and he is like proposing a theory called MET, Material Engagement Theory, and he also has a book called How Things Shape the Mind, and he basically go a bit ahead of like the standard extended cognition theory, and puts it a bit together with Bateson ecology of mind, and like basically he states that all cognitive processes are built on an interaction with objects and things in the environment. I think like it's in some way another way of seeing of making sense of objects as ontologic realities. Like we can't test it scientifically, as Zach was saying. I totally agree. So it will always be speculation in some way. But if we assume that in fact objects not only can have relations themselves, but can even have even a role in our cognition. Like, I think it's in some way also another point towards their ontological existence.
That sounds really interesting, and I think it's really compatible with a lot of stuff from philosophy too. The main point is uh, you cannot separate what you know, what you perceive, what concepts or beliefs you have from the material aspect of it. Material um, in the sense of relations with the world and with the objects of the world that also contribute and constitute a lot of what we have as um, cognitive structure or perceptive structure.
Yeah, definitely, it's exactly these kind of arguments that is bringing, and he considers this theory like compatible with speculative realism. He states that explicitly. So, so I think it can be interesting to discuss it together, especially if you consider like a long time frame, like a long history of cognition, concepts that we consider completely existing just in our representation as representations in our mind are actually or can be seen historically as having formed in relation with objects, even just like sign traced in things, or like lines drawn in papers. So like, especially if you consider this historical time frame, like it's almost impossible to think about representations without uh, a material existence of some material relation with objects before the thought could even exist.
Yeah, I was going to say before, when you described the article, that it reminds me a lot of the idea of extended intelligence. I don't know if you've heard of that, but
yeah.
I really remember in studying in university, like the concept of intelligence, which I personally find very confusing. I mean, very not very useful. There are different currents of like what's intelligence. There was like a moment of like there is people thinking about general intelligence versus context specific intelligence and things like that, and there is this whole stream of or theory about like like humans being, it makes no sense to understand our intelligence as just what's inside our brains, because most of the things that detach us from other animals actually come from us using tools. So anything from writing to math or whatever. I mean, so yeah, I think this, I don't know if there's, I don't even know any names of people who defend this, but I think it's pretty close to what you're describing, no?
One thing that maybe deserves more discussion in a longer frame, but I'll say it briefly. That what you brought up, Giorgio, I think I would emphasize the point that you made. I think that speculative realism is super compatible with kind of scientific realism in a large aspect of it anyway, not all of it, but and so it's a very nice ontology on which to base. But basically, I'd like to discuss how the kind of typical neuroscience position puts the brain inside, or puts puts us inside of a box, inside of a brain. And from that position, there's a sort of implied there's a contradiction, because it's saying we're inside, we're trapped, we're kind of in the Hume's situation. We could be a simulation, we could be whatever, and at the same time wants to say that all the brain bits and or the computer bits or whatever else, that's that can't be inside the brain. That's cognizing that must be postulated already as existing. So it's sort of self-contradictory to be an empiricist kind of view where you're inside of this brain and to say there's a brain. I think the typical neuroscientist is actually in this kind of weird self-contradictory position, and the speculative realism is a nice antidote for that problem, which I think in the end is much more friendly to scientific thinking.
Okay, so on that note, I suggest we go to bed. And yeah, see you next time. Thank you for being with us. And
Good night.
Good night,
good
everyone.
night. Bye.
Bye. Good night.